Why would you want to become part of an evil organization? You shouldn't. And so the narrative that has been dominant for just about 10 years now, though I think the pendulum's swinging back a bit. The narrative, you saw people with signs in 2020 saying, quit your job. Well, a lot did. Happy now? How did that make things better?
Welcome to the Unspeakable podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. Before I introduce my guest, Peter Moskos, I just want to say a couple of things regarding the podcast. First of all, I want to thank you for your patience over these last few weeks and months. As you probably noticed, I'm experimenting with a couple of different things. The format of the podcast, I have added live streams on the Substack platform. If you are a paying subscriber, you know that the way you support the podcast is through Substack, where you get all kinds of extra stuff, bonus content. You can read my writing, various things going on there. Substack is encouraging us, and rightfully so, because it's fun, to do live streams. And that means that we sort of set up our phones once a week or so and talk to you guys directly, and the audience interact with you. There's a chat. And I have been doing that under the banner of the Unspeakeasy Live. This podcast is called The Unspeakable. This thing is called The Unspeakeasy. I am slowly rebranding this whole thing so that this is the Unspeakeasy podcast, because I think we've kind of moved past unspeakable times and are into something a little easier. But I realize this is all a little bit confusing. So I just want to ask you to bear with me a little longer. I'm going to try to make everything as clear as possible. And I'm going to keep bringing you these proper interviews, the real flagship kind of content here. Are these podcast interviews. So I'm going to go back to doing them once a week. I was thinking about dropping down to once every other week, but I think once a week is better. And we will do the live streams once a week, not twice a week. I tried twice a week for a while. Anyway, thank you for sticking around. Please keep being a paying subscriber if you are. What else do you need to know? My book, The Catastrophe Hour, is out. People seem to be really liking it. So I hope that you will check that out. I'm going to be doing some audio episodes where I read from it, and we're going to be doing a book club for paying subscribers starting in the next few weeks. So that's what's happening there. Okay, my guest, Peter Moskos. He is, for my money, the best person to talk with when it comes to understanding American policing. He is a professor of police science and criminal justice at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. He also worked as a Baltimore City cop as part of his research and training, and he wrote a book about that. Peter was one of my very first guests when I started this podcast back in the summer of 2020, the summer of mostly peaceful protests. And it was a stunningly illuminating interview about use of force in policing, the prevalence of police shootings, which are much less common than most people think, the effectiveness of policies like broken windows and stop and frisk. He came back in 2023 to talk about the state of things, and he is now back to discuss his brand new book, Back from the Brink: Inside the NYPD and New York City's Extraordinary 1990s Crime Drop. The book is getting rave reviews, deservedly so, and so I am delighted, as always, to bring you this conversation with Peter Moskos. Peter Moskos, welcome back to the podcast.
I'm thrilled to be back on your fabulous podcast.
Oh, well, so last time you were here a little over 2 years ago, you mentioned that you were working on a book that had been very long in the making, a book about the New York City Police Department and the quite remarkable drop that happened during the 1990s. That book is now out. It's called Back from the Brink. Inside the NYPD and New York City's Extraordinary 1990s Crime Drop. I'm holding it up here. People can see, if people are watching on video, they can see my many Post-its where I took many notes. It's a fascinating book. I will say the 90s was a long time ago. And a lot has happened with policing and in New York City since then. So why did you want to focus on that decade?
It really goes back even further. I started graduate school in sociology at Harvard in 1995. And, by 1996, 1997, murders were down more than 50% in New York City. And I'm reading all the academic experts in sociology and criminology basically say that would be impossible because they claim police don't impact crime, which is a weird truism in parts of the academic world, a weird false truism. And I'm reading these experts and I'm thinking, well, they're obviously wrong. So this is probably a good field to get into, and it's really why I got into the policing field. And so it's been in the back of my mind since then. And I've been visiting New York since really the late '80s, but and I mean, I could see what was going on. Clearly, something was happening. It wasn't, Giuliani was cutting social spending. It wasn't from that angle. And, murders ended up going down 80%. So I've always, and then I know it's something about Comstat, it's something about Bill Bratton and his crew. But when I did my first interview for this book before I really had an idea of what it would be in 2014. So it's been a 10-year odyssey. And I was like, you have these weekly meetings, Comstat, and people make a big deal out of that, and as they should. But how do weekly meetings stop people from shooting each other on the street? And that was really sort of the mechanism I wanted to get at. It's even overly simplistic to say, police did it, which I think is a true statement. But what does that mean? And what are the lessons that can be learned? And so that part, I'm hoping, still is applicable to any era because often we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to see what works and have the political will and the leadership to do it again.
I want to get into the structure of the book and the choices that you made. I mean, it's riveting. Partly because it's really set up as an oral history of this period of policing in particular, but also going back into the 70s. But before we get to that, can you just kind of summarize the conventional wisdom around the crime drop? I mean, you just talked a little bit about it, but I mean, I think a lot of people are still under the impression that obviously the city was bankrupt in the 70s. In the 80s, there was a lot of crime. There was the crack epidemic. Many people have the perception that David Dinkins, who was the mayor in the late 80s into the early 90s, didn't do anything, and that it was Rudy Giuliani who came in and, just kind of cracked the whip and changed everything. How is that inaccurate?
It's overly simplistic. The key period was the Giuliani and Bratton period. I give Bratton more credit. I mean, Giuliani appointed him, but he also quickly fired him, let's not forget. Giuliani was able to ride the wave of what the NYPD was doing, and he did provide political support. So I'll give him that, but he wasn't coming up with the ideas, and in some ways he mischaracterized them as well. I don't think if he ever fully understood what was going on under him, but he was the mayor at the time. Dinkins is, especially in the book, I mean, I don't dislike him as much as people in the book do. He was pretty much hated by all the cops, as ineffectual, as hands-off, and also as anti-police. But a lot of the groundwork, the foundation, was under Dinkins. He is the one who got Safe Streets, Safe City passed, which brought in another thousands of cops into the NYPD. But because of the timing of it, they didn't graduate from the academy until he was no longer mayor. But he was, the major proponent of that bill. The squeegee men situation was actually solved under Dinkins, which is funny because in some ways he lost the election on that issue. It was a very close election that he lost.
Explain what the squeegee men were. Sorry to interrupt you, but for those who have mercifully forgotten this era or tragically forgotten it.
Yeah, both. It's funny because everyone from that era knows that. I mean, it was such a big deal at the time. The squeegee men were people who stood in the road outside bridges and tunnels into and out of Manhattan and cleaned or dirtied your windshield, but were, getting money from motorists for an unwanted service.
But they would, just to be clear, this was like extortion, right? They would mess up your car. They would spray stuff on your car windshield while you were sitting at a light or getting out of Lincoln Tunnel, but then they wouldn't clean it off unless you paid them. Right?
Yeah, there was an element of extortion involved. I'm sure some did a better job than others, but it was seen, and it was a point of, just you're trapped in your car, give me money. And it was such a big issue. It was part of the mayoral campaign, but it turned out that, it wasn't thousands of people, as was the perception. They were just well located. It turned out to be, I forget the number off the top of my head, but they counted them. And it was, 100 or something. It wasn't that many. And this was one of the problems, similar in that sense to graffiti on subways, which preceded this. That was seen as, well, we just can't solve it. It's a problem of poverty. It's a problem of housing. It's a problem of drug use, all that we still hear today in different contexts. And it turns out it could be solved in a matter of weeks. And it was Mike Julian was the cop involved. This happened under Ray Kelly in his first term as commissioner under Mayor Dinkins. And they brought in George Kelling, Mr. Broken Windows, and they first recorded people, and basically Mike Julian found a legal reason that they could ticket these people, and it turned out that to go into the street asking for money had been illegal since the Bowery Bum days of the earliest 20th century. And that's, it's the little details like that. They say, I learned this studying for promotional exams. We don't need to pass a new law. We just need to enforce it. And another key part is it wasn't that everybody was locked up. And this is a constant and reoccurring theme of policing, which is you are policing behavior. And the goal wasn't to lock up the squeegee men. The goal was to get them off the streets. And so they warned them, and then they would arrest them. But the squeegee men didn't want to get arrested, so they stopped. They changed their behavior. And then you have to be relentless. And you have to keep doing it. And they did it every 4 hours. And, it took a couple weeks, but that's it. And the squeegee problem was basically gone forever. Oh. Though you still see it occasionally. But it's funny because it triggers the NYPD. Like precinct commanders will get a call about the squeegee men at the Queensboro Bridge. It's still, there's still bad memories.
Throwback Thursday, the squeegee man.
Yeah.
Okay. So I know you really start your history in this book in the 1970s, but I'm curious, just really briefly. Obviously, the city was bankrupt in the 70s. There's a whole bunch of reasons that crime went up, and there was just this overall sense of just disorder. But what was policing like in this 1960s or like the 50s? Like what we imagine as kind of this great sort of Mad Men era of New York City. Was it just were there just fewer people there? Was there a lot of corruption? Why was it supposedly working in those decades?
Well, society certainly was different back then, both for better and for worse. In the process of writing this, originally when I started, I thought the time frame of the book was going to be later. I thought it would be like 1990 to the present. And as I interviewed these cops and other people, I realized two things. One was you have to show the dysfunction of the city in the earlier decades. And that's in the 70s and late 60s were when the men and women who became bosses, that's when they went on the job. So sort of as a narrative arc, it worked well. I also realized I couldn't pass through the year 2001 because of September 11th. And in oral history, you can't just say, and then that happened and move on. So I either had to set the book before 2001 or after 2001, and before is when the story happens. So that's why I picked those decades. So my research really starts in the late 60s. So in a way, your guess is as good as mine. Maybe, it's my field. Maybe my guess is slightly better about how policing was back then. But there was systemic corruption. There was much more overt racism. And, this de facto segregation. But the city didn't change drastically till crime skyrocketed in the late 60s. And that's, it is complicated. But part of it was the streets were in essence depoliced both through car patrol. Got the old beat cop. There's a lot of there's nothing by accident in the book. So when I talk about the old cops talking about being alone on foot patrol back in those days, there's a point to that because I think it was a more effective form of policing, and choices were made, intentional and unintentional. But those cops were basically taken off the streets. There was also, similar to today, there was the idea that police are an agent of oppression and racial oppression in particular. So there was a move to reactive policing. You get a cop when you want one, but they won't be in your face when you don't want one. And I think that was a disaster for public order. And then you had, heroin started ravaging cities, and you had white flight, you had working class flight, and the general decline. And so all that contributed. And then you get the 70s and the Bronx is burning, and sort of the classic images of abandonment and decay. And people were worried. Cops were worried. This was, I try and portray the sense of concern they had for their city. And they were born here and they lived here. And some of them moved out, but they still cared about New York City, and they didn't want to see the city decline. But the police department was in a very reactive mode. And Louis Anemone, who became chief of department, talks about it, that the NYPD cared about corruption, going back to Serpico, which was a monumental change in terms of getting rid of systemic, organized, routine corruption in the NYPD. Cops just accepting money to tolerate, numbers runners, gambling, and drug dealing and everything. So that part had changed in the 70s. But so the police department was focused on avoiding corruption, avoiding scandal, avoiding urban riots. And to some extent, then they were happy to buy the academic party line that it wasn't their job to fight crime. And that became the status quo, I think, throughout most American cities, but certainly in New York, for 2 decades. And the illustrative part, I think, is that when Bratton became commissioner, and his right-hand man was a man by the name of Jack Maple, who's probably the biggest character in the book. And Jack Maple asked the higher up chiefs in the NYPD, how many people were shot last year? Last year being 1993. And nobody knew. The NYPD didn't know how many people were shot in New York City. It's hard to imagine that.
Who would know? But wait a second. Obviously, those numbers are kept somewhere. Like, is it the coroner's office or like some other investigative body?
Well, so they counted for 1993 because he said, I want to know how many people were shot last year. And they had it, but there was no consolidation. They were only keeping the stats to send to the FBI for the Uniform Crime Reports, which doesn't keep track of shootings and still doesn't. So it was a matter of just saying, why don't we actually keep track of how many people are shot? They knew how many people cops shot since the early 70s, and it was a lot. But they didn't know. So we still don't know how many people were shot in 1990 in New York City, the most violent year. And it was probably something around 7,000. Wow. And we just don't know.
Wow.
So, the simplest thing about what caused the crime to crime was a change in the mission statement. I mean, after that comes all the hard work. But they said, well, why don't we actually focus on reducing crime and focus on the people committing the crime, the repeat violent offenders and so on. Then comes the hard work, but that had never been tried. They abdicated the responsibility of crime prevention.
That's amazing. Yeah, between 1985 and 1990, murders increased by 63%. I mean, that's an incredible figure.
And that was also part of the crack epidemic, which that was a nationwide phenomenon, and so some of that, as crack receded in the early 90s, you would expect to see a 20% decline. That was about what crack was responsible for, but it kept going, and it kept going at a faster and faster rate, and so that's the real change.
You set this book up as a series of testimonials. You write the introductions to each chapter, but it really is you've got these characters and they're speaking for themselves. I almost feel like I'm watching a documentary, and you weave their stories, in a really nice way. And I feel like I know these people. Why did you decide to do the book this way? I mean, is this something I know you've been working on it for 10 years. So why did you decide to do these as people telling their stories as opposed to you telling the story for them?
Certainly when I started, I assumed it would be a more standard format where I'd be telling the story based on my research. But I'm interviewing these cops. I'm listening to their voices, which some of it comes through the printed page, but I mean, boy, you can't get all the voices. They say the demise of the New York accent is somewhat exaggerated. They're just fabulous to actually listen to them. And then I said, why am I going to paraphrase these cops who are so articulate? They tell the story so well. I can't add anything to their words. And so then there was the dilemma that I actually am not a fan of oral histories. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to write the book I want to write, and we'll see sort of how it ends up. I'm not certain about this statement. I believe it is a novel format. Maybe someone's done it before, but I've looked and I haven't been able to find an example. What I do is I weave together a narrative. A traditional oral history will have a statement, and then the author analyzes it, and there might be another statement related to that. But it ends up being very disjointed in my mind, with lots of short statements. So I was aiming for sort of op-ed length, 800 to 1,000 word pieces by each speaker, and then weave them together without me interjecting. Now, I should say, my voice is in there with every punctuation mark. It's very difficult, I found, to, transcribe the spoken word into a way that's readable, that both captures the speaker's voice and, is grammatically correct in his paragraph structure. I would show sections to the speakers because I would say, look, this is going to be you talking. I need you to recognize yourself in this. And the less I edited it, the more they didn't like it. They didn't like to read the actual verbatim transcript until it flowed well. And so, I mean, it's, everything in the book is what they said. I didn't make anything up. But it is edited for readability, and partly that was at speakers' requests. And then, of course, it was great because they could add things in. They could correct a few things because I want the book to be, true to history. And it was interesting because I'm talking to people who are speaking about an era from decades ago. And with a few exceptions, Jack Maple he died in 2001, so I got access to the tapes he used for his books. Thanks to Chris Mitchell for that. And sometimes they would talk about the weather. Jack Maple at one point says, it was a warm Christmas, and Gretchen Dykstra talks about her flight being canceled in Portland, Maine. And so I would, weather reports are actually very easy to find. And so I just go, let's make sure that there was, was there a warm Christmas? And sure enough, there's the year, and it was, 63 degrees on December 24th. And I go, they're not making this up. Their memories of some of this stuff was amazing.
Yeah. And so I don't expect you to list everybody who's interviewed, but just so people can get a sense, I mean, you've got captains, patrolmen, detectives, reporters, people at all different levels, and people who, started their careers very young and then rose up through the ranks, and sort of talking about that trajectory. Can you just give a sense of the main players? I mean, obviously Ray Kelly, the police commissioner, factors heavily. Louis Anemone, who you mentioned. Who would you say are kind of the 4 or 5 most prominently featured speakers?
Jack Maple, Bratton's right-hand man, Bill Bratton himself, the commissioner. Louis Anemone, who ran Comstat with Maple, and probably Billy Gorta, who was just a lieutenant, but he was a major part in sort of the behind-the-scenes part of Comstat. He and John Yo had to actually go and get the numbers from the police precincts. And they both also are fabulous voices in the book. There really are so many. I'd say those are the major ones, but there's another choice I have to make. I spoke to hundreds of cops over the years, and I formally interviewed about 50. Um, I think there are 30 voices in the book, and I feel bad for the 20 who are left out. But there's so many. I'm thinking of the reader, and even 30 is a lot to keep track of. Originally, when I started, I thought I would do a Studs Terkel style history where I describe his books as sort of pointillism approach to a documentary nonfiction.
Mm.
In that, I read his book on the Depression. I'm like, well, why is he speaking to this woman who wasn't even alive? And you have to read about a third of the book before it starts to form this overall picture. So my thought was speak to everybody and have a picture coalesce. There's a problem with that, which is it's just too long. And books aren't as long as they used to be. And originally this was supposed to be 80,000 words. It came in at 120,000, passed through a couple publishers, which is another story. But there are about 10,000 words in an hour of conversation. So there are only 12 hours in the book. So 95% of everything is on the cutting room floor. And again, those are choices that are made. So I did have to pick, many people would say one thing. I had to just pick one and go with that person. But I did purposely try and get people of different ranks and positions because I didn't want it to be, yes, the leadership is very important, but ultimately they're not the ones on the street carrying out the strategies and the tactics. So I tried to get people of different ranks and different positions. Then I love the two transit cops in the book, Bob Davin and Steve Hill, who both have fabulous voices. And, I've gotten to know a lot of these people. Some of them were my students at John Jay College. Many of them I met the first time when I interviewed them, and they, opened up to me quite quickly. I credit my brief policing background for that. They basically trusted me to not skew what they were saying and to understand what they meant. So there are 30 people in the book. Most are cops. There are Lenny Levitt, the reporter. There are two professors, George Kelling being one of them. And then there are the business improvement district leaders. And there's one chapter that isn't very related to policing directly, but it laid the foundation and sort of showed a Jane Jacobs approach to urban life. And that covers Bryant Park and the revitalization of Times Square and the Port Authority bus terminal. There's so many little interesting stories. The first class I ever taught as a professor was in 2004. And I was talking about broken windows, and a student in my class, who's in the book now, Jeff Marshall, and he's a colleague at John Jay and a friend, he said, I was a Port Authority cop, and we did this thing called Operation Alternatives at Port Authority, and it sounds very much like what you're talking about, and I had never heard of this. And so that planted another seed for the book. I was like, well, someone's got to tell this story. And I interview the bus station manager, Ken Filmus, and he was so happy. He was so proud of what he did. He's a high-level bureaucrat in the Port Authority organization. His name is maybe not now, but had been lost to history. And what he did in that bus terminal was transformational. And part of the fun about doing these interviews is you get that sense of pride of what these men and women did at the time. And it was so thrilling to sort of let them tell their story.
Yeah, the Port Authority chapter was fascinating, and especially for me. So I grew up a lot in New Jersey, so a huge part of my growing up and young adulthood was taking the bus into Port Authority. And I'm back in the 80s. It was another world. I mean, you would go into the restrooms, and there would be prostitutes that looked like out of central casting. I mean, we were not calling them sex workers. These were, the classic. I remember going in there as, like a preteen or something. And I guess I was with my mother, but there were women in there washing up and talking about the next John. And I remember they were made up, and just, it was like you were on a movie set. So
I mean, there's an area called that was called the meat rack, where were for male prostitutes and pedophiles to pick up young boys. I mean, it was out of control.
right. The Port Authority
I
should
spoke
really,
to,
that could be its own show. Like that should have been like a season of it could be a season of The Wire. It could be its own like David Simon kind of.
I was speaking to a friend of mine, the red-headed tapster into the New York Post review of my book, which is a very New York Postian phrase. And she said, I was one of the people in her thick Irish brogue. I was one of the people who used those phone banks. I would go there and call my mom, speak for half an hour. And she was like, I was kind of sorry to see that go. I was a frequent customer.
Right.
And I should explain. So these were phone banks, and people would steal credit card numbers, and you'd pay them, $5, which was a lot of money back then, but they would make the call for you to anywhere in the world, and you could speak for as long as you wanted back when, international phone calls were expensive. And they had different banks, and like this one's known as the Middle East banks. This one's for South Asia. And it was, and the manager said, Ken was saying it was tough for us because we were actually making money off that calls because they took a rake from all the phone calls from the public phones.
Right.
And so he's like, this was against our financial interest, but we knew that we had to get control of this situation.
Yeah, and the phone bank thing was an example of something that actually was a service to people. I think that was one of the more positive aspects of the Port Authority. But I mean, I thought it was really interesting the fact that it couldn't be policed because even though it's inside the bus terminal, it's considered public space.
Yeah, and so that is linked. It was a huge legal decision in I think 1991 about the transit department, because this was when Bratton became transit chief, which was a separate police department at the time, and he implemented rules, and they got sued by the usual suspects, and the initial court decision came out against the transit. So was all the commuter rails and the New York City Transit and Port Authority were the defendants. And the idea was that these rules against panhandling and other things were unconstitutional. And it went to the state Supreme Court, and they ruled that begging is not a constitutional right in the subway because it is a confined space. So it allowed these rules of unique public spaces, in essence, that you could enforce certain rules. But I mean, the Port Authority, the main part is a public space, but then you can set up parts for ticket holders and sort of create safe zones within that. But it allowed these systems to get homeless people out of the bus terminal and out of the subway. And I also want to emphasize, whenever that was done successfully, it was always done in collaboration with extensive social services, because they were trying to police their way out of that problem before, and it just didn't work because the people would come back and, they did need help. But the focus, the Operation Alternative was the social services element of the Port Authority part. And on the subways, they led people to shelters when they got them out of tunnels and stations and trains. But the focus was on, you don't have to go to shelter, but you can't stay here.
Right.
But many did go to shelter. But the focus, it's how you define the problem. And in these cases, the focus was on the riders and the transportation system. And they were happy to help the people that needed help. But the idea it wasn't the sense that we have to cure drug addiction and homelessness before we can have a safe bus station.
There were so many details there that were just striking. I mean, first of all, the way that the homeless were living there, they were like above. Can you explain this? They were sort of like above the grates where they could stay warm in the winter and cold in the summer because of the ventilation system.
It's really hard to describe Port Authority bus terminal to those who don't know it. I mean, it is huge, and most New Yorkers don't know it, but
That's
New Jerseyites know it well. And the two key problems, there were others that I didn't make it into the book, but the two key things was when you actually, so it's all inside, even the buses have roofs over them. It's a giant building, and there was an awning over the end where you would get on the buses, and homeless people would go there and live there because it was sort of heated and air conditioned, even in that outside environment. But they would be going to the bathroom on that, and that would be dripping down on people. And then the other part was
This is
and
another
and
problem with New Jersey.
little environmental design issues where there were it was opaque at the bottom, and so homeless people would sleep on the outside of the divider between the waiting room and the bus area. So they made that glass, and that's and that's all part of the problem. And then some of these solutions are shockingly simple, but you need to see them and you need the will to do it. The stairwells were the main trouble places where people were living in there, turning tricks, doing drugs, stashing weapons, going out then to mug somebody, get more drugs, and repeat. And they would give their and this is where they live. They would give their address as the green stairwell in the in the Port Authority address, whatever that is.
When they were arrested, just be clear, they would be arrested,
when they
and
were
then their
arrested.
address would be whatever 8th Avenue, brown stairwell. Okay, right.
And they would do occasional police sweeps going and clearing it, but the problem was that the doors were unlocked. You get in from the outside, you can get in from everywhere. And so they just put in those, even then they were kind of standard magnetic locks where you could get out in an emergency, but you couldn't get back in. And they cleared out those stairwells. And, partly, and I this is very applicable to today. People would say, "Oh, that's mean. That's you're just punishing them for being poor." But these were not safe places for people to live.
Right.
People were dying in those stairwells, both from crime, from disease, from drug addiction. A humane society does not allow people to live in these conditions. And that, I think, is an important part of the message, is to sort of gain the moral high ground here. That malign neglect is not humane, and we do need to do something. But it's also not just about them; it's about everyone else that has to share these public spaces.
One of the things they did was they started to play classical music throughout the Port Authority, and the homeless people didn't like it. Why do you think that was?
Kind of they did so many things. He was never certain which. Yeah, they did so many things at once. It was not a scientific experiment in that sense, but a combination of that's a famous tactic outside 7-Elevens too, in places, that the music would annoy people. Who knows the power of classical music? But it seems, it was part of the bigger picture. It, created what was perceived as a more civil environment, and then they combine that with increasing sight lines, with getting better businesses in there. Like I was, some of this stuff, I'm like, oh, that's kind of a shame. He was a big fan of chain stores as opposed to little independent stores. Well, I'm a fan of little independent stores, but there was a sense that of sort of normalizing the business environment,
Right,
where people would know what to expect and might actually go there to buy something and use it as a destination. And that was a shocker to him, that someone might come to the bus terminal now and not actually take a bus.
Yeah. And just something like changing, I think it was Timothy's Coffee was the example, changing it so it was glass on the outside, just reconfiguring the kind of architecture of storefronts.
Yeah. And it took a lot of money. The cops bought in because of overtime, basically, which is another little underlying theme in the book. And yeah, to emphasize that there were beds and services across the street for people to go to, so you could humanely say you can't stay here.
Getting back to the people interviewed in the book, one of the things that I thought was the most powerful was the way every person starts out by saying where they grew up in the city, what their parents did, where they went to school, what their childhoods were like, what they thought they would be when they grew up. And so many of them talked about taking the civil servants exams, being tracked into the police department or the fire department or whatever it is. And it was such a portrait of the working class throughout these decades. And I wonder
I'm glad
how
you caught that.
Oh, that was really at the essence of the book. And I wonder how your thinking around all of that changed or was affected as you had these conversations with people.
It started with the conversations because I know policing is a very working class environment because I did it. But I see, I see these people, when they're retired, or when they start dressing well, when they're detectives, and I think it's important to understand. I mean, so it struck me that, like, Louis Anemone grew up in public housing. I didn't expect that. Jack Maple was a very, Queens working class guy. And Bill Bratton, he's dresses to the nines now, and has his cufflinks and monogram shirts, and he grew up very working class in Boston. And this does go back, and I honor Studs Terkel and his contributions to oral history, but I did want this to be about work, and to humanize the people involved. I mean, I think as a writer, it's a savvy move, but it's also an ethical move to try and show that. And I don't ask them about their personal lives, because again, it's not what the book is about, and there's length issues. But I started every interview, at least after a while, by asking what their parents did. Sometimes I would take them back because they thought I'm going to talk about jump right into the crime drop. But I think that's an important part to portray. And for so many of these people, they did not grow up dreaming of being a cop. A few did. But by and large, most said, my father said, take the city's tests, and the police called first. And so I could have become a sandman. I could have gone in the post office or corrections. But I became a cop because it was a stable job with benefits. And I don't know. It's telling, and it shows sort of the motivations of what they want in life, and what they want on the job. And of course, the ones I'm interviewing, did well on the job, right? I would have loved to have found one of the people that sort of lost their command because of Comstat, some of the old crew that are referenced. It was tough. Partly, a lot of them probably died because they were older. So it's very, in an oral history, you're limited by people being alive. And maybe maybe their experience wasn't as good, and so maybe they weren't as eager. So it's not a random sample of cops that I'm talking. There's some randomness to it, especially at the lower ranks. But once I realized what the story was, then I started to get the major players. So it's a way to humanize them, to talk about their backgrounds and why they became cops and their childhood. And Bill Bratton called me when he read the book, and it's such a fabulous line that he left on my answering machine. I wasn't home. And he said, I learned so much about the people and organization I've known for so long. And I really like that. And I don't know specifically what he was referring to, but I'm guessing it's things like Mike Julian's brother overdosing. That probably didn't come up on the job. He growing up in a heroin ravaged Park Slope, which is hard to imagine today, given this, and just how many of his friends died from drug overdoses, and then others died in Vietnam. And that's, that's part of the story too.
That's a really nice thing for Bratton to say. I'm also impressed that you have an answering machine. That's
I threw that in there, right?
Yes.
It goes with my landline.
Well done. Yes. Yeah. And just the number of them who would talk about, the kids that they grew up with, some of them going the wrong way. Like they would talk about, sort of coming out of their circumstances, lower class, working class, and that, most of the kids actually ended up doing okay, but there were a few that got on the wrong path. But there was a sense in so many of them that taking the civil servants exams, getting into these jobs, it was a way to make it in the world. It was a way to sort of get into, some kind of middle class existence, and it was workable. And I don't want to dwell on this too long, but I mean, did you have a sense that they were talking about their route into these kinds of jobs in a different way than people would maybe talk about it who are starting out now?
To a large extent, no. And I think we've lost touch in a way with that working class cop becoming America. I think it has changed somewhat. I don't think it's exactly the same. But I mean, for one thing, the job has become a lot better paying, and it still is a civil service position, and they're hiring. So in New York City, you see a lot of immigrants and kids of immigrants. These are my students and John Jay becoming cops. And in that sense, it's for the exact same reason. It's a different ethnic group and a different generation, but they're doing it for exactly the same reason, which is nobody in their family, and this, this is a overly broad statement, but nobody in their family has had went to college. Nobody's had a stable job with benefits. And so it can be a real step up into the, American middle class now, and kind of upper middle class at that. I also like to show, some of the cops grew up in the ghetto. Some of them grew up in white public housing ghettos. Some of them grew up in Eastern Queens from more middle class backgrounds. Joanne Jaffe, who became a chief, she says that I forget if it's her mother or grandmother, would always say, "This is my daughter Joanne. She has a master's degree." Like,
exactly.
That was still
She's
the important
an academic.
part.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, and she's like, the family came around, but they weren't initially. She wanted to become a cop because she wanted to become a cop, not because she could have gone into another profession by choice, and she chose what she did.
Right. I definitely, when we before we wrap up, I do want to talk about sort of who is becoming a cop now, and what's the demographic, the racial makeup of law enforcement. Because again, I think this is one of these things that people have sort of misguided ideas about. But before we get to that, it's really important that we talk about Comstat. So this is sort of substantively the centerpiece of this book. I mean, that's sort of the most legible turning point for as to why crime was able to go down, and a lot of this stuff became there was just a sort of digital revolution aspect to this. But can you just, paint the scene? Before we had this kind of data tracking come onto the scene, people were like, they had their whiteboards and they had bulletin boards, and they were like, drawing circles around targets and trying to understand, what crime was taking place in what precincts and what areas. And it's the kind of stuff that you can't imagine that nobody ever did, but it was pretty novel, even as.
But see, what's interesting was novel wasn't
the 80s.
What was novel wasn't the technology. That's what gave. All Comstat was at the start was those maps, the pin maps and the whiteboard. The only difference was it was shown on a screen through a computer instead of an overhead projector.
Okay.
And that wowed people. But the idea of keeping a crime map wasn't new. But focusing the department around it, that was a new focus. But there's a page that I put in just for the sake of historical documentation where John describes, writing the original code for Comstat, and, getting a new computer that had a floppy disk thing. And like that part, of course, to get it on a computer was at the time a technological revolution. And it was all done in-house, because you have, in a department that large, you've got computer nerds, you've got everybody in there. And Jack Maple said, we want this done. And so Comstat, what it was a way to crack heads in the department, get everyone in the same room and say, look, we're all in this together, get people out of there's silos. There's a lot, it's not my field, though the book is largely about it. It's an organizational book, how to change the culture of an organization. And so what Comstat did was it made the precinct level commander responsible for crime in his or her precinct. And Artie Storch plays that role in my book, in describing what it's like to be a precinct commander under Comstat. And it became it was very New Yorky. It was hardcore, and there was yelling and screaming, which is sometimes overplayed. But and sometimes you just have to say, it wasn't, it's the way New Yorkers act. But it wasn't, as Artie Storch said, it was amazing that people didn't have the answers because they were asking the same questions all the time. And it wasn't actually that hard as long as you were prepared. You, in essence, knew what they were going to ask, and you just had to have answers. You had to have a plan A and a plan B in case plan A wasn't going to work. And you had to care. And if you did that, you did fine in Comstat. It's probably important to mention that the NYPD is civil service until the rank of captain. And at that rank, you can become a precinct commander. But everything above that, and there's deputy inspectors and inspectors in chief, that is discretionary promotion at the whim of the police commissioner. So you can stay as a captain, but to rise above that, the department basically has to like you. And so that was, you can't fire anybody really, but you can give people different positions, better and worse, and you can give them different ranks at that level. So that was the enforcement mechanism they had to get people on board.
Okay.
Yeah.
And another huge part of this, of course, was the subway. So you talk, a lot about cleaning up the subway. Now, this was not considered public space technically because it was underground, like as opposed to the Port Authority?
Yeah, well, so the subway, graffiti off the subway happened in 5 years in the late 80s, and it preceded the crime drop. And I love the story of graffiti, and I love that Martha Cooper, the photographer, let me use her picture of Bob Davin on the subway, and Bob Davin's in my book, and they had never met. I actually introduced them in my house last year for the first time, 30 years after this iconic picture of a 70s looking cop, though it's the 80s, with a mustache and a leather jacket standing in the graffiti subway that was in her book, Subway Art.
That always turns up on my social media feeds, and people like to make jokes that they look like the Village People or something. There is that. There's a particular mustachioed look that people has different kind of lands differently depending on your generation.
I knew that book from when I was in high school. I mean, I had that book, so I loved to get to the bottom of that. She didn't know who she had photographed. She never, but so the graffiti was clean in a 5-year, again, a sort of bureaucratic brilliance of problem solving and saying, why do people write graffiti? And they got rid of it one train at a time rather than sort of trying to clean it up all together because they couldn't do that. But what's interesting also, you would expect by the broken windows philosophy that would have decreased crime, but it didn't. It made the subways nicer, but it didn't actually have an impact on crime. What brought down crime on the subway, and this preceded the New York City and national drop, and it's a great natural experiment because crime went down on the subway and didn't go down in the rest of the city above ground. And it was through primarily an aggressive focus on turnstile jumping. And they started at the stations where, when they did arrest people, where those people got on the subway as opposed to where the crime happened. And I mean, there's a lot of turnstile jumping now, but it's hard to, I remember it, it was like watching salmon go upstream.
Right.
It was
you felt like a sucker if you were paying. I mean, it's like, what's wrong with
you?
And
that's a key part, is why, you feel like a chump if you are following the rules. And a lot of people want to just pay their fare and not think about it. And what they found was that 1 in 8 people arrested for turnstile jumping had an active warrant. Okay, well, that's easy. Now we've caught them and maybe we've prevented a crime. I think it was about 1 in 80 had a weapon on them. But felony crime dropped immediately, and that surprised them how quickly. And it gave again the sense that somebody is in control in the subway. And at this point, it's going along as well with getting mentally ill and homeless people out. And again, they're not being evicted because of the fact that they're homeless or mentally ill. They're welcome if they follow the rules. It was focused on rule violation. You're not allowed to sleep in tunnels, which seems obvious, but that was a big problem. And you're not allowed to just loiter and live and beg in the subway stations. And robberies really plummeted on the subways. And so then those strategies were later transferred to the rest of the city. There was a year or two lag when Bratton went to Boston, but that was the start of the great turnaround.
And what year are we talking? Like we're now into the 90s. Are we talking like 95, 96?
So the subway improvements happened in the early 90s, 91, 92, and the great city decline started in 94, and the huge decline lasted for about 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the purse snatching thing, that's something that I feel like you just don't see as much anymore. And because I remember, there's like this a couple like really graphic stories of cops talking about people who had like fallen onto the subway tracks, either pushed or been crushed by trains. There's this one, I can't remember the officer, who just talks about coming upon this really horrific scene where a woman had been, crushed by a train. And I feel like, again,
after eating a large Italian sandwich for lunch.
Oh, he had eaten a large Italian sandwich.
Yes.
Yes, not her. Who knows what she ate? But I mean, I remember, like, again, in the 80s, sort of watching the local news, and I feel like every night there was some story about somebody being, like, pushed onto the tracks, or a woman like getting her purse snatched, or like somebody trying to push a baby stroller into the closing subway cars, and the doors would shut on people. Like, what changed? I mean, why, for something like the purse snatching, for instance, like, did that just sort of fall out of fashion, or like, why do we not see that kind of crime anymore? Do people have different kind of purses?
I do think there's less cash around.
That's true.
Different kind of purses.
Yeah.
But there is a certain faddishness to different kinds of crime. But a lot of it is committed by very few people. So you do have to go after those people, and it doesn't just happen. It's people that cops know by name and crime and date of birth because they're repeatedly arrested. So there has to be collaboration with prosecutors. There does have to be some people need to be locked up and taken off the street. Though it's one little detail. Arrests in the 1980s in New York City with community policing and David Dinkins went up more than arrests did in the 1990s under this broken windows and supposedly more aggressive. Well, it was a more aggressive form of policing. But it did not lead to locking everyone up. Stop, question, and frisk happened later, beyond the scope of my book. But some of it was, Bryant Park, where there were a lot of purse snatchings on 42nd Street that Dan Biederman describes. There's less police presence now than there was then, like, because of the environmental changes, because of the minor rule enforcement, where people just aren't quite as free to hang out. The other part, though, and this is key too, is in the old days, if you made an arrest for a robbery, that was considered great. You cleared the case, and the police department started asking, well, did that stop the robberies? And don't just stop with one arrest and the stat. Let's figure out who their accomplices are. Let's go after them. If they're fencing goods, then let's go after them as well. So everybody who was arrested was questioned. And that was a huge part of the actual tactics involved. So they basically got to break up the criminal clique that was involved. And at some point, deterrence does work. And if the potential for punishment outweighs the rewards and the fun, let's not forget crime can be fun, then people will start doing other things. And that, is, again, not only good for the victims, but good for the former and potential criminal.
So when you say start doing other things, what do you mean? Is there any way of tracking sort of what these former criminals then got into or up to?
Not easily, no. That still remains a little bit of a mystery. And there's a line in there, it relates to the squeegee men, where Mike Julian said he'd love to have figured out what happened to those individuals, and it would not have been that hard. But he said it wasn't done because they considered the problem solved, and that was that. So that was sort of a wasted opportunity.
They're not working at a car wash or anything that they would
well,
be.
I mean, that's my guess
in
a way. I think, yeah. I think you start hustling in more legal ways, because you're making more money doing it. Those business improvement districts, hiring people, to clean the streets. I think a lot of people who are having a tough time and engaging in crime, they're not making that much money by and large. Some of them do. But it's funny, even at a low wage, you work 40 hours a week and you start to get paychecks and you're like, well, this is more than I've ever made.
Yeah.
And it's easier.
I found that amazing. So yeah, that detail about the people, the homeless people at the Port Authority, they were kind of recruited into cleaning up the streets and given some kind of, I don't know if they, some kind of uniform, or they were wearing something that, like, made it known that they were working, and they were kind of saying to the other folks hanging around the Port Authority, like, hey, I have a job now and this is working out. And I was actually surprised that many people were willing to work, quite frankly.
Constantly hustling is tiring. And I think there is a certain dignity to work, and you get paid. I mean, and suddenly you can
Yeah.
start buying things. It really is win-win. But so those organizations, deserve respect too. Whether it's the Doe Foundation, there are a bunch of them in New York City that were being used by, particularly in Times Square, by the Business Improvement District, saying, we're going to trust you, and you give us the good names, and we'll give them jobs. And it was a path up.
Okay, well, so let's fast forward a bit. We're in 2025 now. You were first on this podcast in 2020. That was the fateful summer of the summer of mostly peaceful protests and all the rest. And there was a lot to talk about, but at the same time, crime in New York felt pretty under control. The pandemic was underway, but I think we were still in a I think things felt pretty clean and safe. I think a lot of people 5 years on would say that's not how they feel about New York. I wonder how you feel about it. Do you think things are regressing meaningfully, or do you think that some of this is overblown?
A little of both. I mean, right now, I think in May 2025, I think things are actually trending in good directions in New York City, but they're not as good as they were in 2016 and 2017, when things were so good that people somehow thought that we didn't need to have police anymore, and that police were the problem, and that obviously, look how nice everything is. We don't need cops, and so there's been a definite ratchet effect of pulling back on the criminal justice system, and that certain things have gotten worse. They stopped enforcing subway rules. I mean, that was a political choice that happened under de Blasio, and I remember when it happened. And then they confirmed it with transit cops. They were told to no longer enforce rules against loitering and panhandling.
Yeah, why is that? I mean, because a cop is standing there and people jump over the turnstile. Like, is it just like
It's
not
a
a good
political
use of their
choice.
time, or why?
Well, because they were incentivized not to. It was decriminalized. So now if you get caught, you get a warning, and then you get a civil fine. But there were, what if the person does have a warrant? What if they start fighting, and then it's a viral video, and then people blame you?
Right.
There are inevitably racial disparities, so that always will come up. And the idea was, well, how does that help the turnstile jumper? And people aren't just jumping the turnstile because they can't afford the fare. There's some of that, but it was a political choice, and it happened without public debate. And it happened a little bit under public pressure. Let's not forget the goofy movement to decolonize the subways. Like, I hope people don't even know what I'm talking about. Let that be lost to history. But it was real. It happened. You can't gaslight me and say that this stuff
Decolonize the
didn't happen.
subways? I never heard that one.
Well, you can Google it and see that brief era. But people were.
Okay.
It was yes, it was part of the greater abolition movement, and end of capitalism and all that tied together. So now they are enforcing rules a bit more, but there still is a problem of severe mental illness, and that does some of those people are violent, but others are just erratic and demand the attention and alertness of people around them. And I think I can speak for most people in saying, when you commute to work, all you want is an uneventful commute.
Yeah.
You don't want to have to stop doing what you're doing and pay attention to that person. And it bothers me as a human being that I, see the same people every day going to work who are literally dying in front of me on the public streets. And it is not humane to say that's their choice and they have to accept services. It would be nice if they do, but it's not good for them. They're not making rational choices. And we as a society need to do better and help these people. And that means having places for them to go and sometimes mandating things. But also, just for the public's sake, again, saying you can't do that here. It's not good for you. It's not good for us. But in New York, we made, it's legal now to inject drugs in public. I think that shouldn't be permitted. And I don't think that makes me a reactionary either. But that was, again, a political choice. I mean, the cops are limited by the law, and when the laws change, they have to follow that. But a big part is there is a lot of change in policy that can happen at the political level, given the laws we have. And that's just a matter of priorities and a matter of saying, yes, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. And when somebody complains, we're going to respectfully disagree.
Yeah, and I mean, we're going to wrap up in a minute here, and I don't mean to go down this whole other road, but I mean, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Jordan Neely case. I mean, this was in 2023. This was the, notorious, very, very obstreperous, bordering on violent panhandler that was inadvertently killed by Daniel Penny on a subway car, a chokehold situation. Daniel Penny was acquitted and is now a hero in many corners. Whereas you've got Derek Chauvin from George Floyd case, who arguably did a similar kind of maneuver. I don't know all the details, and is in prison for life. I can imagine Derek Chauvin watching everything that went down with the Jordan Neely, Daniel Penny case and having a lot of complicated or maybe not so complicated thoughts. I wonder what your complicated thoughts are.
The standard is higher for cops, and cops should know better. And one of those rules is the person in your custody can't die. I mean, those are the rules. It doesn't mean they will never die, and and you certainly are not allowed to kill them. Now, had a cop did what Penny did, the cop would have been charged criminally because the chokehold would have been. The chokeholds are illegal for cops, but not for the public. That's just the way it is now. I imagine, though, had a cop been in Penny's situation, there's a much greater chance that Neely would not have died. But it was interesting because we have actually pretty good accounts from people on the train of how he was acting, and he was not your standard beggar. I mean, people were terrified of him.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting litmus test on the way, very much like old Bernie Goetz back in the 80s, where you hear a story and you sort of pick one side or the other based on your beliefs and all. Once I saw video of people terrified of Penny when he was on the ground already, but riders, if he gets up, we got to run, hands shaking. And once I saw, Neely on the ground. And once I saw Penny put Neely in a recovery position, he obviously didn't intend to kill him. I said, well, of course he's going to be acquitted. And he was. But there was also some dishonest media portrayal of not showing actually video that was available that didn't fit a narrative on I would say both the left and the right. So that was part of it as well. But it was emblematic of a certain time. But Neely was why don't we hold other? He was known as one of the 50 troubled people in the subway system. He was on the list. And the fact that we somehow couldn't help him, it shouldn't get to that level. And yet we somehow allow it to, and then blame the last person to touch him. But when literally dozens and hundreds have contacted him before and failed to help him.
I think it was the first time you were on the podcast, you said something that really stayed with me, which is that the New York City Police Department is arguably the best police department in the United States, if not the world. Do you still feel that way?
I don't want to say the world because there's a big world out there and I don't know a lot of it. And there are a lot of good police departments. But I think by the American standards, given our laws, our policies, our guns, and our poverty and our race relations, it's certainly it's one of the better ones. I will say there have been some problems of late because of corruption at the top from people the mayor has appointed. And that has, right now, I think it's better with Jessica Tisch as commissioner. Since there hadn't been a major scandal in the police department for decades, and so that's very worrisome when I started to see crooks at the top of the police department. And they're out of the police department now. They're still close to the mayor, so that's it's a red flag. But in terms of the rest of the department functioning in terms of, yeah, it's a very, I mean, in a way, like you tell me how you want to judge a police department, and the NYPD does pretty well, whether it's on crime prevention, whether it's on, avoiding unnecessary use of force, avoiding, I mean, by all these standards, yeah, they do a pretty good job. And part of that is because there are a lot of critics. Part of that is because there still are good leaders and chiefs in the police department. But the point of this isn't to say, wow, great job, guys. It's to, we could be learning from best practices. There are police departments that need help, and a lot of them don't get attention because of either the politics or because of the isolation of the area, whether if it's a small department. Um, we need to, I mean, especially 5 years ago, it's like we're going from sort of scandal, we're going from incident to incident, and we're not fixing anything. There is a more scientific way to do this. There are, you know, some smart professors out there who are actually interested in improving policing as opposed to simply criticizing or defunding or abolishing. And so you do have to, you got to go around and say what is done right in different departments. And some of it is unique to an area, but a lot of it can be applied to policing nationwide.
So my last question is, what is the state of recruitment for law enforcement? And what would you say to somebody who is young and maybe thinking about getting into this? I mean, first of all, I think they should read your book, because just to read the stories of these people and how they got into this field and their backgrounds, and like I said, it's really so much the story of working class um, aspiration and just sort of seeking a place in the world. But what we hear all the time is that they can't recruit anybody. Like, there's not enough people applying to the police academy. Nobody wants these jobs. Nobody wants to end up on a viral video. The kind of public reputation of being a cop, it's not as positive as it used to be, to put it mildly. So is anything being done to mitigate that, or what would you say to try to convince somebody to get into this work?
It's a tough sell right now. It depends on the jurisdiction. Um, some police departments are recruiting just fine, and those tend to be places that have more supportive political leaders, and a more supportive public. But even in cities, uh, the public is still by and large quite supportive of police. It's the political environment. I mean, I used to joke back 25 years ago when I was a cop in Baltimore. You at least you had to do something wrong to get in trouble. And often, you could do something wrong and not get in trouble. But you knew if you didn't do something wrong, you'd be okay. And so that is what has changed through legitimate use of force. The cops can do the right thing and still get in trouble and face public scrutiny and sometimes, public threats and things like that. There's been a migration of cops away from certain cities into other cities. So overall, collectively, it looks fine, but there is a recruitment problem now. And some of that, I think it's important to remember, flaws and all and warts and all, that there is a certain nobility in the job. And you have to use that to get people to become a cop, that you are on the side of good. And, with great power comes great responsibility. You have to use that right. But why would you want to become part of an evil organization? You shouldn't. And so the narrative that has been dominant for just about 10 years now, though I think the pendulum's swinging back a bit. The narrative, you saw people with signs in 2020 saying "quit your job." Well, a lot did. Happy now? How did that make things better? The false ahistorical narrative that somehow the NYPD comes from slave catchers. It's just those things do real damage, because you want to become. I mean, the job that does have its problems, so you want to at least know you're on the side of good. And I think so that suddenly the idea. I mean, she's not in my book, but I interviewed her, and she just retired after many years in the NYPD. And I remember her telling me she's a large Black woman from New York, lives in New York, rose to the rank of deputy chief. And I remember her saying, if I'm looked down at one more young white bitch telling me I'm racist, I'm gonna fucking throttle her. And this was during the mostly peaceful protests of 2020. But she's like, they're not from the city. They
Right.
don't know what I'm through. Like it was it was such a weird situation for her to be in as a Black New Yorker. And yeah, at some point you don't like being yelled at for all you are paid, to some extent that can be your job, but you didn't get into the job to be called racist by some 20-year-old white girl.
No, that's why you go into academia.
Exactly. But so that, it's funny because politically, police are still the third most trusted institution in America after small businesses and the military. And it's just weird to have the 20% sort of dominate the public vibe for so long, the 20% that hate cops. And you gotta, push back on that. And I think that's happening a bit. But that really, it does relate to recruitment and also retention, let's not forget. I mean, morale. Right now, the problem in the NYPD is forced overtime. It's killing the department. You think you have a day off and suddenly you don't. That's why people leave the department. And it's not the same in other cities that have better staffing and less work, quite frankly.
Well, Peter, congratulations on this book. It's really wonderful. I'm holding it up again for those who are watching back from the brink. No, it was a long time in the making, but
and right now it's sold out on Amazon. So hopefully by the time this drops, it'll be back restocked.
Okay, well,
to Amazon.
you can always order it. Amazon will catch up quickly if there's if there's a bunch of standing orders, I'm sure they will fill them. So yeah, please, everybody should buy the book. And it's always great to talk with you. So thanks so much for coming back.
I love talking to you on this podcast. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Let's do it again. That was my conversation with Peter Moskos. He is the author of Back from the Brink: Inside the NYPD and New York City's Extraordinary 1990s Crime Drop. I'm showing it to you again if you're watching on video. We should say that we recorded this on May 14th. I'm going to try to turn this around as quickly as possible. And the book is selling so well that Amazon has run out of copies. So if you are listening and you're running to your computer to order from Amazon and it says it's not in stock, just pre-order it. Just put your order in now. They will print copies quickly and you'll get your copy, or you can order the ebook. Anyway, highly recommended. What else do you need to know? You can order my book, The Catastrophe Hour, which is hopefully not, they haven't run out of copies on Amazon, but who knows? I'm going to be starting a book club for The Catastrophe Hour, starting in the next few weeks. That will be for paying subscribers. So join the Substack and become a paying subscriber there to find out all about that. You can go to meghandaum.substack.com or just the Unspeakable podcast.com. We are slowly rebranding this podcast, the Unspeakeasy podcast. We're doing live streams every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. That's called the Unspeakeasy Live. I don't know, a lot going on, trying different things. Thanks for bearing with me as I figure it all out. And I will be back next week with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for listening. See you then.